Elias Thorne came to the mountains to forget the sound of a voice. It was a specific voice, calling his name over the dry crackle of a radio, a sound swallowed by the whine of helicopter blades that were already lifting away. He had come here to trade that memory for the sigh of wind through lodgepole pines and the indifferent silence of granite peaks. For 3 years, the trade had almost seemed fair. He lived in a small, clapboard cabin he'd repaired himself, set back from a gravel road that was more of a rumor than a thoroughfare. His world had been deliberately shrunk to the dimensions of a topographical map, its borders defined by ridgelines and the stamina of his own 2 legs. His only companion was Ghost, a German shepherd whose muzzle was turning a dignified gray, a veteran of the same forgotten war Elias was trying to outrun. The dog was not a pet. He was a partner, a silent witness who carried his own history in the slight stiffness of his back leg and the watchful, assessing nature of his gaze. Their mornings were a ritual of quiet discipline. Elias would rise before the sun, his movements economical and sure in the cool darkness. He'd pull on the same uniform he'd worn for years, a faded red plaid flannel shirt, olive cargo pants, and leather boots whose creases held the dust of 100 lonely trails. Over it all went the M65 field jacket, a garment that had become a second skin, its collar turned up against a chill that was more than just the mountain air. He checked the military-issue watch on his wrist, a habit ingrained so deep it felt like a prayer. It wasn't his watch. It had belonged to the man with the voice on the radio. Ghost would be waiting by the door, not with the eager whining of a dog, but with the patient stillness of a soldier waiting for orders. His breathing was the only sound in the cabin, a soft, rhythmic puffing that was as much a part of the silence as the creak of the floorboards. Elias would nod, a barely perceptible dip of his chin, and Ghost would rise, his body uncoiling with a fluid grace that belied his age. This morning was different. The air was heavy, charged with the kind of stillness that precedes a storm, though the sky was a clear, pale blue. The birds were quiet. Even the aspens, whose leaves were usually in a constant chattering dance, hung motionless. Elias felt it as a pressure behind his eyes. He paused on the porch, his hand resting on the worn leather of his Eberly stock half-track backpack, and scanned the tree line. Nothing. Ghost stood beside him, but his posture was wrong. His head was high, his ears pricked forward not with general alertness, but with a focused, analytical intensity. His nostrils flared, tasting something on the air that Elias could not. He wasn't looking at the woods, but up the faint trail that led higher into the folds of the mountain, toward a place Elias seldom went. "What is it, boy?" Elias murmured, his voice rough from disuse. The dog didn't look at him. He took a single, deliberate step forward, his body rigid, a low rumble starting deep in his chest. It wasn't a growl of aggression, but of profound unease. It was the sound Ghost made when he located something that was fundamentally wrong, something that violated the natural order of the place. Elias had heard it twice before, once for a concealed tripwire on a dusty road overseas, and once for a man hiding in a ravine who should not have been there. He trusted the dog more than he trusted his own eyes. He slung the pack over his shoulder, the familiar weight a small comfort, and gave another nod. "All right, lead on." Ghost moved. He didn't bound ahead but trotted with a grim purpose, his nose just above the ground, following a scent that was apparently as clear to him as a painted line. He led Elias away from their usual circuit, pushing up a steep, overgrown path marked only by the occasional blaze on a tree, so old the bark had nearly swallowed it whole. The trail climbed for nearly an hour, the air growing thinner and cooler. Elias moved with the steady, ground-eating pace of a man accustomed to long marches, his focus narrowed to the dog's tail and the placement of his own feet. The silence of the forest pressed in, no longer peaceful, but watchful. They broke through a thicket of scrub oak and stopped. Before them was a small, high meadow, and in its center stood the skeletal remains of a cabin. It was ancient, the roof long collapsed, the logs silvered and bowed with time. It looked like the bones of some great beast that had laid down to die a century ago. Elias had seen it on his maps, marked simply as Homestead, but had never felt the need to visit. It was a piece of history, and he was trying to escape history. Ghost, however, walked directly toward it, his purpose unwavering. He ignored the sagging doorway and moved around to the side of the structure, to a place where the foundation of river stones was still mostly intact. He stopped at the base of the chimney, a teetering stack of rock and crumbling mortar. He sniffed once at the packed earth, then again. He looked back at Elias, his amber eyes holding a strange, insistent light. And then he began to dig. It wasn't a frantic, playful digging. It was methodical, obsessive. His powerful front paws threw dirt and stones behind him in measured arcs. Elias watched him, a knot of tension tightening in his gut. This was not normal behavior. Ghost was a trained working dog, not a pet who chased squirrels. He did not waste energy. "Ghost, leave it." The dog paused, panting, and looked at him. There was no defiance in his gaze, only a profound, almost desperate plea. He whined, a low, sharp sound that cut through the quiet air. Then he turned back and dug with renewed vigor. Elias walked over, crouching beside him. The air here was different. There was a faint metallic tang to it, an old, cold smell like iron and damp earth. He ran his hand over the ground where Ghost was digging. It was hard, compacted. He pushed the dog gently aside. "Easy, boy, let me see." Ghost sat back on his haunches, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the spot. Elias pulled the folding knife from his pocket, its blade clicking open with a familiar, reassuring snap. He used the tip to probe the earth. It was soft for a few inches, then he hit something hard. Not a rock. The sound was a flat, unyielding thud. It had resonance. He spent the next hour working with the small entrenching tool he carried in his pack. The sun climbed higher, burning off the morning chill, and sweat traced lines through the dust on his neck. Ghost sat sentinel, never taking his eyes off the hole, a statue of focused intent. The object slowly revealed itself. It was dark, rusted iron, a flat surface about 2 feet square. As he cleared the last of the dirt away, he saw the hinges on one side and the circular dial on the front. It was a safe. The thing was old, a block of pitted, rust-colored steel half buried in the earth at the foot of the chimney. It looked as ancient as the cabin itself, a relic from a forgotten time. The dial was frozen, its numbers obscured by a century of corrosion. A heavy, ornate handle was fixed below it. Elias knelt, running his gloved fingers over the cold metal. Who would bury a safe out here, in the middle of nowhere, at the foot of a ruined homestead? He tried the handle, putting his weight into it. It didn't budge. It was locked as tightly as the day it was buried. He stood up, wiping his hands on his cargo pants, and looked around the clearing. The ruined cabin, the silent trees, the vast, empty sky. It felt like he had stumbled into a story that had been paused for 100 years, and Ghost, for reasons of his own, had just pressed play. Ghost nudged his hand, his nose cold and damp. He looked from the safe to Elias, his expression clear. This matters. Elias looked down at the iron box, then back at his partner. The quiet life he had so carefully constructed had just been breached. The past he had come here to bury had been replaced by someone else's, unearthed by his dog. He felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders, the unwelcome burden of responsibility. He couldn't just walk away. He couldn't rebury it and pretend it wasn't there. The dog wouldn't let him. And if he was honest with himself, his own training wouldn't either. A problem, once identified, had to be solved. He spent another hour assessing the situation.
The safe was too heavy to move by himself. At least, not easily. It was probably a good 300 pounds of solid iron. Getting it out of the ground was one thing. Getting it down the mountain was another. He needed leverage, and he needed a plan. His mind, long accustomed to a state of quiet observation, began to shift into a different gear. It was a mode of thinking he hadn't used in years, a tactical assessment of angles, fulcrums, and logistics. He used his entrenching tool to dig around the entire perimeter of the safe, clearing a wide trench. He needed to see what he was dealing with. It was a simple cube, no visible weak points, no external locking mechanisms beyond the dial and the handle. It was built to resist. He found a sturdy, fallen log and tried to use it as a lever, wedging one end beneath the safe's lip. He strained, the muscles in his back and shoulders bunching. The log creaked, but the safe only shifted a fraction of an inch, settling deeper into its earthen bed with a sigh of finality. Defeated for the moment, he sat back. The sun was directly overhead now. He took a canteen from his pack and shared some water with Ghost, pouring it into his cupped hand. The dog drank greedily, his pink tongue lapping at the cool liquid, his eyes never straying from the iron box for long. Elias drank too, the water tasting of metal and plastic. He looked at the watch on his wrist. 12:30. The numbers seemed to glow with a faint accusatory light. He remembered another time, under another sun, when time had run out. He shook the memory away, a familiar reflexive flinch. He couldn't leave the safe here. Now that it was exposed, anyone stumbling upon the clearing could find it. He felt a strange, illogical sense of ownership, of guardianship. It was his discovery, his problem. He made a decision. He would go back to his cabin, gather more equipment, ropes, a block and tackle, perhaps a small sledgehammer, though he doubted it would do much against this kind of steel. He would try to get it open here, and if that failed, he would figure out a way to haul it down the mountain. Before he left, he did one more thing. He used his shovel and hands to cover the safe again, packing the dirt back over the top, trying to make it look as undisturbed as possible. He took fallen branches and scattered them over the spot, then brushed away his own footprints with a pine bough. It was a weak attempt at concealment, but it was better than nothing. It was an operator's instinct. Sanitize the site. "Come on," he said to Ghost. "Let's go." The dog gave the camouflaged spot one last, long look, then turned and fell into step behind him. The journey back down the mountain felt different.
The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with the presence of the iron box waiting for him on the mountainside. The world had tilted on its axis, just slightly. Back in his own cabin, the familiar space felt alien. The neat stacks of books, the clean lines of his sparse furniture, the polished wood of the floor. It all seemed like a facade, a stage set for a play about a man at peace. He felt the intrusion of the outside world like a physical pressure. He pulled out his gear, laying it on a tarp on the floor. Heavy-duty ropes, carabiners, pulleys from his old climbing kit, a crowbar, a 4-pound sledge. Looking at the tools, he felt a surge of the man he used to be, the man who solved problems with force and precision. But he knew, looking at the sledgehammer, that brute force was a blunt instrument. This felt different. This mystery required something more than just breaking it open. It required understanding. He packed what he needed, his movements quick and efficient.
Before he could leave, a thought struck him. A cabin that old, a safe that heavy. It wouldn't have been carried up here for no reason. It belonged to the place. It was part of the property. And property, even abandoned property, left a paper trail. The trip to town was a violation of his self-imposed exile.
He hated the noise, the smells, the casual, unthinking proximity of other people. He drove his old, dusty pickup truck the 40 minutes down the winding mountain road to the small town of Jasper Creek. The town was little more than a wide spot in the road, a collection of false front buildings that catered mostly to summer tourists and hunters in the fall. He parked in front of the county courthouse, a squat red brick building from the 1920s. Ghost remained in the truck, his head visible in the rear window, his gaze following Elias as he walked toward the entrance. The dog was on watch. He always was. The air inside the building was thick with the smell of old paper, floor wax, and dust. It was quiet, the only sound the lazy hum of a fluorescent light overhead. He found the county clerk's office at the end of a long, tiled hallway. The sign on the door was hand-painted. Martha Reed, county clerk. He pushed the door open. A woman sat behind a massive oak desk surrounded by towering shelves of leather-bound ledgers. She was in her late 50s, tall and spare, with sharp blue eyes and graying hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was a roadmap of long winters and dry summers. She looked up as he entered, her expression neutral, patient. "Can I help you?" Her voice was low and clear, a no-nonsense instrument. Elias felt the familiar constriction in his chest that came with talking to strangers. He kept his hands out of his pockets, a habit from a life where hidden hands were a threat. "I'm looking for old property records," he said. "Plat maps, maybe. For a piece of land up north of here. An old homestead." She studied him for a long moment, her gaze taking in his worn jacket, his disciplined posture, the quiet watchfulness in his eyes. She'd seen men like him before, men who came to the mountains looking for something they had lost. Most of them were just passing through. He had stayed. "Which homestead?" she asked, her pen poised over a notepad. "It's marked on the old USGS maps. Section 14, Township 3, up near Whisper Creek." Martha's eyebrows raised a fraction of an inch. "The Calloway place. No one's been up there in 50 years. The road washed out in the flood of 78. She looked at him again, a new curiosity in her eyes. "What's your interest in it?" Elias hesitated. The truth was too strange, too complicated. "I was hiking, found the old cabin, got curious about the history." It was a partial truth, the easiest kind to tell. She seemed to accept it. She stood and walked over to a large, flat file cabinet in the corner of the room. "The Calloways," she said, her back to him as she pulled open a wide, shallow drawer. "They were one of the first families to settle this high up. Came out from back east after the First War. Had 2 sons. Word was, they were tough as pine knots." She pulled out a large, rolled-up map, its edges yellowed and brittle. She spread it carefully on her desk, weighing down the corners with heavy glass paperweights. It was a survey map from 1925, drawn in elegant spidery ink. She ran a long, unadorned finger across the paper until she found the parcel of land. "Here it is, 160 acres, patented to a Thomas Calloway in 1921. Elias leaned over the map. He saw the square of land, the creek, the faint dotted line indicating the old trail he had followed. There was the cabin, marked with a tiny hand-drawn square. But there was something else. A note, scribbled in the margin in a different hand, with a later date. "Disputed. See File 28B, RG, 1947. "What does disputed mean?" he asked. Martha squinted at the note. "RG. That was Robert Gaines. He was the clerk here for 30 years, a meticulous man. If he wrote disputed, it means there was a fight over the title." She went to another cabinet, this one a standard metal filing cabinet, and pulled open a drawer labeled Archived Disputes. She thumbed through the files, her movements practiced and efficient. Here we are, 28B. The file was thin, containing only a few brittle typewritten pages.
She read through them, her expression growing tight.
Well, that's odd, she murmured. According to this, Thomas Calloway and his family abandoned the property in the fall of 1946. Just packed up and left. The land was declared derelict and sold at auction the following year to pay off back taxes. Who bought it? Elias asked, his voice low. She flipped to the last page. A holding company, Mountain Valley Resources. They bought up a lot of the old homesteads around that time. She looked up at him. They still own it. Or rather, the corporation that absorbed them does. A big development firm out of Denver. Why? Elias thought of the safe. A family doesn't just abandon a property and leave a locked safe buried in the ground. People who are leaving in a hurry take what's valuable. People who are planning to come back, however, they might secure their valuables until their return. Just curious, he said again. He felt a prickle on the back of his neck.
This was no longer just a mystery. It was a story with missing pages.
If you're really interested in the Calloways, Martha said, seeing something in his face he hadn't intended to show, you should talk to Samuel Blackwood. He's the town historian, lives over on Pine Street. If anyone knows the story behind that dispute, it's him. She wrote the address on a slip of paper and handed it to him. He's a bit of an eccentric, but his memory is longer than this county's tax rolls. Elias thanked her and left, the slip of paper feeling heavy in his hand. As he stepped back out into the bright sunlight, he saw Ghost shift in the truck, his head turning to track a man walking down the opposite sidewalk. The man was in his late 40s, dressed not in the local uniform of jeans and work boots, but in expensive hiking trousers and a clean, new Barber jacket. He carried himself with an air of easy authority, the kind that came from boardrooms, not barracks.
He glanced at Elias's truck, his eyes lingering for a moment before moving on.
It was nothing, a casual glance, but Elias's training screamed at him. The man wasn't looking at the truck. He was assessing it. He filed the face away. Samuel Blackwood lived in a small house overflowing with books. They were stacked on the porch, they filled the windows, and when he opened the door, Elias saw they lined every wall from floor to ceiling. The air smelled of paper and pipe tobacco. Samuel himself was a small, wiry man in his 70s with a wild mane of white hair and eyes that sparkled with an irrepressible energy.
"Martha Reed sent you," he boomed before Elias could even speak. "Said you were asking about the Calloways. Come in, come in. No one's asked me about the Calloways in 30 years.
He led Elias into a cramped study where maps were spread over every available surface. A tragic story. A mystery, really. He pulled a thick, leather-bound scrapbook from a shelf. I've collected what I can over the years. Newspaper clippings, a few photographs. He opened the book. There they were. A black and white photograph of a man and a woman standing in front of the very cabin Elias had just left, though in the photo it was new, the logs still pale. The man, Thomas Calloway, was tall and lean, with a serious, unsmiling face. His wife stood beside him, her arm linked through his, a faint, hopeful smile on her lips. Two young boys stood in front of them, dressed in overalls.
"That was taken in 22, Samuel said, his voice softer now.
They built that place with their own hands. Thomas was a veteran of the Great War, gassed at Belleau Wood. Came out here for the clean air. They were good people, hard workers, respected." Martha said they abandoned the place, Elias said. Samuel snorted, a sharp, derisive sound. That's the official story. The one Mountain Valley Resources paid the county to believe. The Callaways would never have abandoned that land. It was everything to them. He flipped a few pages to a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1946. The headline read, "Local Family Vanishes." "They disappeared," Samuel said, tapping the article with his finger. One week they were in town buying supplies for the winter. The next, they were gone. The sheriff went up there, found the cabin empty, food still on the shelves. But the family, their truck, all their personal belongings, gone. No note. Nothing. And the land was sold, Elias stated. To the very company that had been trying to buy it from them for 2 years, Samuel said, his eyes flashing. Mountain Valley wanted the water rights from Whisper Creek. They were buying up all the land on that mountain. Thomas Callaway was the last holdout. He refused to sell, told them his land wasn't for sale at any price. Then, conveniently, he and his family vanish into thin air. Elias felt a cold certainty settle in his stomach. The safe wasn't a sign of people planning to return. It was a sign of people who feared they were about to lose everything. They had hidden the one thing they couldn't afford to lose. But what was it? Deeds? Money? "Did you ever hear anything about a safe?" Elias asked, trying to keep his voice casual. Samuel's eyes narrowed. He looked at Elias, truly looked at him, and a slow smile spread across his face. "You found it, didn't you? By the old chimney." Elias didn't answer, but his silence was enough. "I knew it," Samuel breathed, his excitement palpable. "Old man Hemlock, a trapper who lived up there back then, told my father a story once. He said he saw Thomas Callaway and his oldest boy, Michael, wrestling a big iron box out of their truck one night. Said they buried it near the hearth. Hemlock figured it was the family silver. I always thought it was something more. Proof. Something to use against Mountain Valley. The pieces were clicking into place, forming a picture that was dark and ugly. A family erased, their story rewritten by a corporation. "That company," Elias asked, "Mountain Valley Resources, who are they now?" "They're called the Apex Group now," Samuel said with distaste. "Fancy new name, same old greed. They're planning a big ski resort and luxury development on that whole north face. Been fighting with the Forest Service over permits for years. They finally got them approved last month." The man in the barber jacket, the casual, assessing glance. It hadn't been random. He was scouting. Elias felt the hairs on his arms stand up. They knew he was here. They must have seen his truck, seen him hiking in that direction. He stood up. "Thank you, Samuel. You've been a great help." "What are you going to do?" the old historian asked, his eyes wide with a mixture of hope and fear. "I'm going to open a box," Elias said. He drove back up the mountain, the truck's engine laboring on the steep grades. He drove with a new sense of urgency, a feeling of being watched. When he got back to his cabin, the feeling intensified. Nothing was out of place, but the air was charged. Ghost met him at the door, not with his usual quiet greeting, but with a low, guttural growl, his eyes fixed on the woods behind the cabin. Elias didn't bother going inside. He grabbed his pack and the tools he'd laid out earlier and headed straight back up the trail to the Callaway place, Ghost moving silently at his heels. This was no longer a matter of curiosity. This was a mission. He was no longer just a man hiding from his past. He was a guardian of someone else's. It was a role he hadn't asked for, but one he now felt he could not refuse. The mountain held its breath around him, waiting. When he reached the clearing, the sun was beginning to dip behind the western ridge, casting long, distorted shadows across the meadow. The place felt different, colder. The branches and dirt he'd used to cover the safe were disturbed. Not by an animal. The work was too neat. Someone had been there. They had uncovered the safe, looked at it, and then covered it back up, just as he had done. It was a message. We know. Elias felt a cold knot of anger tighten in his chest. He worked quickly, his movements precise and economical, all wasted motion stripped away. He uncovered the safe again, the iron gleaming dully in the fading light. He had a block and tackle, ropes, and a crowbar. He found a thick, strong branch high up on the ancient pine that grew beside the chimney, and slung his rope over it. He attached the pulleys and hooks, creating a primitive crane. It was a slow, laborious process. He wrapped heavy straps around the safe, hooked it to the tackle, and began to pull. The rope strained, the pulleys groaned in protest. Slowly, agonizingly, the safe lifted from its earthen prison. It swung free, a dark pendulum of forgotten secrets. Elias grunted with the effort, his muscles screaming. He managed to swing it over onto a patch of flat, solid ground a few feet from the hole. It landed with a heavy, final thud that seemed to shake the very foundations of the ruined cabin. He was breathing heavily, sweat stinging his eyes. Ghost stood beside him, a silent, furry pillar of support. Now for the hard part, opening it. He took the sledgehammer from his pack. It felt clumsy and brutal in his hands. He looked at the dial, the frozen handle. There had to be a better way. I wouldn't do that if I were you. The voice came from the edge of the clearing. It was calm, reasonable, and utterly devoid of warmth. Elias straightened up slowly, turning to face the sound. Ghost was already facing that way, his body coiled like a spring, a low, menacing growl vibrating in his chest. The man in the Barber jacket stepped out from behind a stand of aspens. It was the same man he'd seen in town. He was not alone. Two other men, bigger and dressed in rugged work clothes, fanned out behind him. They were carrying nothing, but their hands were empty and ready. That's private property you're on, the man said, taking a few steps forward. He smiled, a thin, polished smile that didn't reach his eyes. And that's our property you're playing with. My name is Jennings. Elias said nothing. He kept one hand on the handle of the sledgehammer, his body positioned between Jennings and the safe. He could feel Ghost's muscles bunched beneath his hand, a reservoir of controlled violence waiting to be released. I represent the Apex Group, Jennings continued, as if explaining something to a simple child. We own this land, all of it. We've been aware of this little historical artifact for some time. We were planning a professional and respectful recovery. You've simply saved us a bit of trouble. You were here earlier, Elias said. It wasn't a question. Just confirming its location, Jennings said smoothly. We appreciate you doing the heavy lifting. Now, if you and your dog would be so kind as to step aside, my men will take it from here. Elias thought of the Calloway family, of the newspaper clipping, of Samuel Blackwood's hopeful, fearful eyes. He thought of the watch on his wrist. He had walked away once. He wouldn't do it again. No, he said. The word was quiet, but it hung in the air with the weight of the iron safe. Jennings' smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I don't think you understand. You're trespassing. This isn't a negotiation. That box belongs to us. This land belonged to the Calloways, Elias countered, his voice steady. They disappeared. You bought it for back taxes. I think whatever is in this safe explains why. Jennings let out a short, humorless laugh. You've been listening to local ghost stories. It's a charming, if irrelevant, piece of folklore. This is a simple matter of property law. Now I'm asking you one last time. Step aside. As he spoke, the two men behind him began to move forward, their steps slow and deliberate. They were flanking him. It was a classic pincer movement, sloppy but effective against a single opponent. Elias didn't move. He simply looked at Jennings. "You don't want to do this." It was then that Ghost made his decision. The low growl in his chest deepened, erupting into a single, sharp, terrifying bark that echoed through the clearing.
He took one step forward, lowering his head and baring his teeth. It was not a threat. It was a promise. The two advancing men froze in their tracks. They were tough, but they were not stupid. They knew what a trained German shepherd was capable of. Jennings's face hardened, the mask of civility finally slipping away. "That's a mistake," he said, his voice cold as the iron safe. "A big one. You have no idea who you're dealing with." He pulled a satellite phone from his jacket pocket. "We'll be back, and we'll have the legal authority to remove you and that animal. And when we open that box, we'll make sure its contents are put in the proper context. Which is to say, they'll be buried so deep no one will ever find them again." He turned and walked away, his men falling in behind him. They melted back into the trees, and the clearing was silent once more, save for the sound of Elias's own breathing and Ghost's low, fading growl. The sun had set. A deep purple twilight bled across the sky. Elias knew Jennings was not making an idle threat. He had a short window of time. He had to get the safe open. Now. He turned his attention back to the iron box. The sledge was a last resort. He thought back to his training, to forced entry techniques. He examined the hinges first. They were heavy, set deep into the frame. No purchase there. The dial was his only option. Old safes like this, the locking mechanisms were often simpler, more susceptible to manipulation if you knew what you were listening for. He knelt, placing his ear against the cold steel door. He took the crowbar and used the tip to apply gentle, steady pressure on the handle, trying to create tension on the locking bolt. With his other hand, he began to turn the dial. Slowly. Click by click. He wasn't a safecracker, but he had spent countless hours learning to listen, to feel for the subtle tells of a mechanical device. The fall of a tumbler, the shift of a gear. It was about patience and focus. The forest grew dark around him. A sliver of moon rose, casting a pale, ghostly light. The temperature dropped. Ghost lay down a few feet away, a dark shape in the gloom, his head on his paws but his eyes open, watching the trail. Click. A faint metallic sound, different from the others. He felt it more than heard it, a tiny vibration through the steel. The first tumbler. He reversed the direction of the dial. The silence was absolute. The world had shrunk to the space between his ear and the iron door. He was no longer in the mountains. He was inside the mechanism, feeling his way through a maze of wheels and pins. Click. The second tumbler. He held his breath, reversing direction again. His fingers were numb from the cold. His back ached from his crouched position. He ignored it all. Click. The third and final tumbler fell into place. He felt a subtle give in the handle. He took a deep breath and pulled. With a deep, groaning screech of rusted metal, the heavy iron door swung open. Elias sat back on his heels, his heart pounding. He shone his flashlight into the dark interior. It was not filled with gold or silver. It was filled with paper. There was a stack of documents tied with what looked like a leather cord, and on top of them, a thick, ledger-style journal. He reached in, his hand trembling slightly, and lifted out the journal. The leather cover was stiff and cold. He opened it to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise, written in faded black ink. My name is Thomas Calloway. If you are reading this, it means I have failed to protect my family and my home.
It means the men from Mountain Valley Resources have won. He spent the next hour reading by the thin beam of his flashlight, Ghost, a warm, solid presence at his side. The journal told the whole story. It detailed 2 years of harassment and intimidation, low-ball offers followed by threats,
Fences cut, livestock poisoned, wells fouled. Thomas had documented everything, meticulously recording dates, times, and names. The name Jennings appeared more than once. It was the grandfather of the man he had just met. The Callaways had gone to the law, but the local sheriff was on the company payroll. They were isolated, alone. The final entries were filled with a growing sense of desperation. Thomas knew they were coming for him. He feared for his sons, for his wife. He had gathered all the evidence he had, the original deed to his land, a surveyor's report proving his water rights, sworn affidavits from the few neighbors who were brave enough to speak up, and his own detailed journal. He had bought the safe and buried it, a last desperate act of preservation. The final entry was chilling. They are coming tonight. I am sending my family away. I will stay and face them. May God have mercy on my soul. Elias closed the journal. He felt the weight of the last 70 years settle on him. Thomas Callaway hadn't vanished. He had made a stand, and he had lost. The story of his family abandoning the property was a lie constructed to cover up a crime. This safe, this journal, was his last testament, his final voice. He heard a sound, a branch snapping down the trail. Ghost was on his feet in an instant, a silent shadow moving to the edge of the clearing. Elias quickly gathered the journal and the documents, stuffing them into his backpack. He closed the heavy safe door, though he couldn't lock it. He had what he needed. Headlights cut through the trees. Not one set, but two. A vehicle was coming up the old, washed-out road. Jennings was back, and he had brought more than just 2 men. Elias grabbed his pack and faded back into the trees on the opposite side of the clearing, Ghost moving like smoke at his side. He didn't run. He moved with a practiced, deliberate stealth, putting distance between himself and the cabin. He found a vantage point on a small rise overlooking the meadow. 2 heavy-duty pickup trucks rumbled into the clearing, their high beams carving up the darkness. Jennings got out of the first truck. This time he had 4 men with him, and they were carrying tools, heavy pry bars, a gas-powered cutting torch. One of them, a younger man with a military-style haircut, hesitated for a moment, his eyes scanning the trees. He looked uncomfortable, out of place. This was Cole, the conflicted insider. "It's open," one of the men shouted, pointing at the safe. Jennings strode over to it, his face a mask of fury. He threw the door open and saw that it was empty. He let out a roar of frustration that was anything but polite. "Find him! He can't have gone far!" The men spread out, their flashlights cutting frantic paths through the darkness. The sky, which had been clear, was now covered with a thick blanket of clouds. The wind picked up, moaning through the pines. The storm that had been threatening all day was finally arriving. Elias knew he had to move. He couldn't go back down the trail. They would be expecting that. He had to go up, over the ridge, and try to circle back to his cabin through the wilderness. It was a longer, more dangerous route, especially with the storm rolling in. But it was his only chance. He started to move, keeping to the shadows, Ghost sticking close to his leg. A sudden, brilliant flash of lightning lit up the entire mountainside, followed a second later by a deafening crack of thunder. The heavens opened up. Rain began to fall, not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets. The storm was a gift and a curse. It would cover his tracks, but it made the terrain treacherous. Rocks became slick, and the ground turned to mud.
He pushed on, relying on his internal compass and his memory of the maps. He and Ghost moved as one entity, a man and his dog against the rage of the mountain. He heard shouting behind him, faint on the wind. They were still searching, but their efforts were hampered by the deluge. He risked a glance back. The lights of their truck seemed small and distant. He had a lead. They were scrambling up a steep, rocky outcrop when it happened. A bolt of lightning struck a massive old pine tree 100 yards away. The explosion of light and sound was staggering. Elias felt the ground shake. The tree, ancient and rotten at its core, split apart with a sound like a cannon shot. A huge section of the trunk, a piece of wood the size of a small car, broke free and came crashing down the slope. It was a chaos of splintering wood and flying debris. Elias threw himself flat, covering his head. He felt a searing pain in his shoulder as a sharp piece of wood grazed him. The avalanche of timber roared past him, just a few feet away. When the noise subsided, he pushed himself up, his ears ringing. He was alive. He called out, his voice hoarse. "Ghost!" There was no answer. He scrambled over to where the dog had been. He saw him pinned beneath a heavy branch, a thick limb from the shattered pine. The dog was breathing, but it was shallow, ragged. He let out a low, pained whimper. Elias's blood ran cold. The world seemed to slow down, the sound of the rain and wind fading to a dull roar. He was back on another mountain, halfway around the world. The helicopter blades were whining, the ramp was closing. A voice was calling his name over the radio, a voice full of static and desperation. He had made a choice then, a tactical choice. Leave one man to save the rest. A choice that had hollowed him out, leaving him with nothing but the weight of a dead man's watch. He looked at Ghost, trapped and hurting. He looked down the mountain toward the safety of his cabin. He could leave the dog. He could save himself and the journal. It was the logical, tactical choice. Preserve the mission. But the mission was no longer the journal. The mission was the dog. "I'm here, boy," he said, his voice thick. "I'm not leaving you." He dropped his pack, the Callaway journal falling unheeded into the mud. He grabbed the branch, his hands finding purchase on the wet bark. It was immense, impossibly heavy. He set his feet, digging his boots into the slick earth, and lifted. Pain exploded in his shoulder, but he ignored it. He roared with effort, a raw, primal sound that was torn from the depths of his soul. He was not just lifting a log. He was lifting the weight of his past, the crushing burden of his failure. The branch moved. An inch. Then another. Ghost scrambled free, dragging his back leg. Elias let the branch fall with a crash. He collapsed to his knees, his body shaking, his shoulders screaming in protest. He reached for Ghost, running his hands over him, checking for broken bones. The dog's leg was injured, but it didn't seem to be broken. He licked Elias's hand, a weak, grateful gesture. Headlights appeared through the trees below them. Jennings's men. They had heard the crash. They were closing in. Elias looked at Ghost. The dog couldn't run. They were trapped. He grabbed his pack, his mind racing. There was no way out. He had made his choice. He had chosen loyalty over escape. He had stayed. And now they would both be lost. He helped Ghost to his feet and started to move, half carrying, half guiding the injured dog toward a small overhang of rock he had spotted earlier. It wasn't much, but it was cover. As they reached it, one of Jennings's men broke through the trees. It was Cole, the young vet. He saw them, and for a second their eyes met. Elias saw the conflict in the young man's face. Cole raised his flashlight, pointing it away from them, up the slope. "Nothing over here," he shouted back to the others. Looks like the rock slide went down the main gully. He's probably buried. He held his position for a moment longer, giving Elias a barely perceptible nod, then turned and moved off, his light disappearing into the rain. It was a small act of defiance, a quiet rebellion, but it was enough. It bought them time. Elias settled into the small rock shelter, pulling the injured dog close for warmth. The rain hammered down, a relentless curtain of gray. He had made his stand, not with a weapon, but with a choice to stay. He didn't know what the morning would bring, but as he sat there in the dark, with his loyal partner pressed against him, he felt a strange sense of peace. The voice on the radio in his memory was finally silent. The storm broke just before dawn. The rain tapered off to a drizzle, and a pale, watery light filtered through the clouds. Elias was cold, stiff, and his shoulder was a throbbing knot of pain. But he was calm. Ghost was curled at his feet, sleeping fitfully, his injured legs stretched out. Elias had spent the last hours of the night thinking. Jennings would be back. Cole's misdirection wouldn't hold them for long. He had the journal, the proof. But he was one man, injured, with an injured dog, against a corporation that had already made one family disappear. He needed help. He took the satellite phone from his pack. It was a piece of gear he carried for emergencies, a link to a world he preferred to keep at a distance. He hesitated for a moment, then dialed a number he hadn't called in over a year. His sister's voice was sharp with sleep and concern. "Elias? What's wrong? It's 5 a.m. "I'm okay, Sarah," he said, his own voice sounding strange to him. "I need you to do something for me. It's important." He gave her the names. Martha Reed, the county clerk. Samuel Blackwood, the historian. The Apex Group. He told her a condensed version of the story, stripping it down to the bare facts. "I need you to call the state police, and maybe a reporter, someone from the Denver Post. Tell them the story. Tell them about the Callaway Journal. Tell them to talk to Martha and Samuel, and tell them to come to the old Callaway homestead. Fast." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Elias," she finally said, her voice soft. "Are you in trouble?" "I'm fixing something," he said. It was the truest thing he had said in years. "I have to go." He disconnected the call and stood up, wincing as his shoulder protested. He helped Ghost to his feet. The dog put a little weight on his injured leg, but he was limping badly. The descent would be slow. They started back down the mountain, not toward his cabin, but back toward the scene of the crime. Back to the Callaway place. He was done running. It took them 2 hours to get there. When they emerged into the clearing, it was a scene of controlled activity. 2 state police cruisers and a Forest Service truck were parked near the ruined cabin. A tall, uniformed woman with a no-nonsense air was directing a small team. It was Martha Reed from the clerk's office, standing beside her, pointing at the open safe. Jennings was there too, his expensive jacket now stained with mud. He was talking to a state trooper, his hands moving in placating, reasonable gestures. But the civility was gone from his face, replaced by a pinched, desperate anger. As Elias and Ghost stepped into the clearing, all conversation stopped. Every head turned toward them. Jennings's face went pale. Martha Reed's eyes widened, a slow smile of relief and vindication spreading across her face. "That's him," she said to the lead trooper. "That's the man who found it." Elias walked forward, the muddy backpack feeling impossibly heavy. He didn't look at Jennings. He walked straight to the lead trooper, a woman with captain's bars on her collar and intelligent, weary eyes. He unslung the pack from his good shoulder and handed it to her. "This belongs to Thomas Callaway," he said. The aftermath was quiet, methodical. The state police secured the site, treating it as a 70-year-old crime scene. The captain took Elias's statement, her expression growing grimmer as he recounted the events of the previous night. Jennings and his men were separated and questioned. Their stories, Elias suspected, would not hold up to scrutiny, especially now that the journal had surfaced. Cole, the young vet, was talking to a trooper, his expression relieved. He had made his own choice. Later that morning, as a forensics team was carefully bagging the contents of the safe, another vehicle arrived. It was his sister, Sarah. She got out of her car and just stood there for a moment, looking at him. Her eyes took in his torn jacket, the mud, the exhaustion on his face.
He hadn't seen her in 2 years, not since he had first retreated to the mountains.
She walked over to him, her expression a mixture of worry and something else, something he hadn't seen in a long time. Pride. "You look like hell, Eli," she said softly. "You came," he said. "Of course I came," she said, her voice catching. She reached out and touched his good arm, a brief, hesitant gesture that spoke volumes. "Let's get you and your dog cleaned up." He looked over at Ghost, who was lying in a patch of sun, his injured leg being gently examined by a paramedic who had arrived with the police. The dog looked up and met his gaze, his tail giving a weak thump against the ground. They were both battered, but they were safe. The story of the Callaways became front-page news. The journal, authenticated by experts, was a bombshell. It triggered a full-scale investigation into the Apex Group and its predecessors, uncovering a pattern of fraud and intimidation stretching back decades.
The Callaway land was placed under protection, and a search was started for any living descendants of the family. Their story would not be erased. Elias did not return to his self-imposed exile. The quiet cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The world had intruded, and he found, to his surprise, that he did not want it to leave. He stayed in town for a while, his sister fussing over him, his shoulder slowly healing. He gave his full cooperation to the investigators, walking them through the events with the clear, dispassionate precision of his old training. One afternoon, Martha Reed found him sitting on a bench outside the courthouse. "The county is putting together a team," she said, sitting down beside him, "to survey and catalog all the old abandoned homesteads in the high country, to make sure no other stories get lost. We need someone to lead the field team, someone who knows the land, who respects the history." She looked at him. "Someone who knows how to find things that are meant to stay hidden." Elias looked out at the mountains, the same peaks that had been his refuge from the world. They no longer looked indifferent. They looked watchful, ancient, filled with stories waiting to be heard. He thought of Thomas Callaway making his last stand, a man who had stayed to protect his home. He looked down at the watch on his wrist. For the first time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a reminder that you can't outrun the past, but you can choose to face it. You can choose to stay. A week later, Elias stood on the porch of the Callaway cabin. The yellow police tape was gone. The place was quiet, reclaimed by the silence of the mountains. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was not empty. It was resonant. Ghost was beside him, his limp almost gone. He leaned his weight against Elias's leg, a familiar, reassuring pressure. Elias had a new watch on his wrist, a simple, rugged field watch his sister had given him. The other one, the one that had belonged to his fallen friend, he had placed in a small wooden box and sent to the man's family, along with a letter he had spent 3 years trying to write. He looked out at the high meadow, at the way the light fell across the silvered logs of the cabin. He had come here to be alone, to be silent, but the mountain had given him a voice, not his own, but one that needed to be heard. And in protecting it, he had found a way to answer for his own silences. He had a new map to follow now,
one that led not away from the world, but deeper into its forgotten corners. He had a job to do. He bent down and scratched Ghost behind the ears. "Come on, boy," he said softly. "We've got work to do." Together, man and dog turned and walked back into the vast, waiting quiet of the mountains. No longer running, but heading home.